Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and your job is to draw the image that you see. We'll have an artist giving a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Many people choose to watch these videos twice. The first time round, they just watch them, and then the second time round, they watch them and draw along. Once you've finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this Raw Umber portrait drawing tutorial. In this tutorial, I will be doing a single 1-hour pose. I'm going to recap on how you can break down the portrait itself and also the features. And I will be using willow charcoal, as well as compressed charcoal, a putty rubber, and finally a blending tool. And this can be anything from a brush to a stump or even your finger. As always, you can find the materials I'm using in the materials box below the video. Now I am working on white paper, but I'm going to start by toning this paper first, and I do this by using willow charcoal, taking the side of the willow charcoal and just rubbing it all over the paper. And don't worry if it picks up a little bit of the texture of the paper at this stage. We'll be rubbing this in with a tissue in a minute. So once I've rubbed that in, I can take a tissue and just rub this all over the charcoal. And I may end up doing this a few times in order to get to a place where the mid-tone, the tone I'm putting down right now, is exactly the middle between the darks of my willow and the white of the paper. And you can test this by using the rubber to carve out some of that white, that highlight that we'll be using later on. And then also putting down the darks on the other side of that. And if everything goes well, the mid-tone should sit nicely in the middle, not too dark and not too light. And these are the 3 tones that I will end up using in this drawing. So the first thing I'm going to do is figure out where I want the skull on the page. So I like to just put a mark down for the top and the bottom of the skull. And this part is completely up to you. So depending on the size of your paper and your personal preferences, you may want to change this to be larger or smaller. Next, I'm going to start dividing this using comparative measurement. And comparative measurement basically means that I'm going to start comparing various parts of the portrait to other parts. For instance, in this portrait, if I take the bottom of the chin to the bottom of the nose, I can see that it's roughly the same as the bottom of the nose to the top of the brow, to the top of the brow to the hairline, and then the hairline to the top of the skull. So we can divide this top to bottom into 4 equal parts. Now, because this is a 3/4 view, I like to look at the center line. The center line is just a line that goes through the middle of the chin, to the middle of the nose, to the middle of the forehead. Another thing that's useful in comparative measurement is comparing the length versus the width. So for instance, I can compare and hold my charcoal from the side of a brow to the back of a skull, and then turn my charcoal, and I can see that it roughly corresponds to the hairline to the bottom of the chin. So as you can see, comparative measurement is really useful. For instance, I can also start looking for where the side of her eyebrow is. And again, if I then measure, I can see that it sits halfway between the side of her brow to the back of her skull. So in this way, I can constantly compare parts of the portrait to other parts in order to get the likeness. So let's continue breaking down the features. Now, I don't like starting with the eye straight away. Instead, I'm looking for the eye socket. This is because the eye socket is the area that holds the eye in place. And you can think of the eye socket as a ridge that goes into the skull. So first, I've got to find the bottom of the eyes. The line I've just made is the top of the brow, and to find the bottom of the eyes I use comparative measurement, and what I see is that halfway down the nose is the bottom of the eyes there. So now I've got the eye sockets, the ridge of the eye sockets, and as you can see, this sticks out a bit and merges into the plane of the forehead. And from there I can see that the cheekbones stick out from under that ridge, get widest around the tip of the nose, and then narrow towards the chin. And to finish the construction of the skull, I can start looking at the shape of the head, starting from the hairline and I'm following that up to the highest point of the skull. And as I get to the back of the skull, I can find the ear by drawing a horizontal line from the nose and from the brow, and the ear will sit in between the two. Once I've got this in, all I need to do is connect the jawline to the chin to finish off my skull. As you can see, this is a very useful way to start creating a sense of the person without venturing into the features too early. Because something that is counterintuitive in portraiture is that the likeness comes from the size of the skull and the shape of the skull rather than the features. And of course, feel free to make any changes here. For instance, I can see that my brow should be sticking out more than the side of the cheekbone. So I'm just going to make some quick changes here using the brush instead of an eraser. And this is just to make sure that I don't lose the nice dark tone of the paper. You can also use your finger for this, or even a Q-tip. And while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. Next, I'm going to start breaking down the features. The first thing I'm going to draw is the curve of the brow towards the corners of the eyes. So I'm just using an imaginary line to connect the inner corner of the eye socket shape to the outer corner of the eye socket shape. And you can imagine that in between there's an axis that holds the eyeball in shape. So you can see or imagine that eyeball sitting in that eye socket like that. And from there, I can simply start drawing the eyelids to surround the eyeball. Starting with the top eyelid, because this is the most prominent eyelid and then connecting that using the iris. And I'm using some compressed charcoal at this stage just because it's a little bit less messy, a little easier to control than willow. To connect the other eye, I just follow the corners of the eyes alone to find the inner corner of the eye that turns away from us, and then do the same thing, rounding the lids to engulf and encompass the eyeball. Feel free to use a blending tool or your finger to gently work this compressed charcoal into the paper to get rid of any texture. So that's how I like to break down the eye sockets. And then I'm not going to spend much time on them right now. Instead, I'm going to work my way down to the other features. First feature I encounter when going down is of course the nose. And with the nose you can imagine it's a wedge shape coming out of the skull. And because this is a wedge shape, the bottom of that wedge of the nose will be darker because it's turning away and under, away from the light. And don't worry about things like the nostrils and that sort of thing right now. Later we can break that down, but for now it's more about the position of the nose in the skull that we drew earlier. Finally, for the mouth, what I like to do is divide the chin to the bottom of the nose up into 3 equal parts. The first part will be the chin, the second part will be the chin to the middle of the lips, and finally the top part will be the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the top lip. And once I've got this position in, I can start looking at the shape of the top lip. Now, even though of course there are lots of individual differences, the basic shape of the lips is always the same. There are two little shapes for the corners of the mouth, and then the top lip will curve upwards towards the middle of the lip. You can almost think of this as a bridge. It connects up and arches over the corners of the mouth. Now there is always a clear tendency to connect up the bottom lip in the same way by using a line dropping down from corner to corner. But this actually can look a little bit flat, and a better idea is to put a little shadow shape underneath the bottom lip in. And this will indicate to the viewer that that bottom lip is sticking out and therefore creating a little shadow underneath it. And finally, don't forget about the mass of the chin itself. It usually will stick out just a touch. That can really make a difference to the likeness. So now I've got the skull shape as well as the features in. So what I'm going to do now is, instead of jumping straight in and putting more information in, instead I'm going to take a step back and just check what I've just drawn and make some small adjustments. At this point, I'm going to start with a mass drawing instead of a line drawing. So I'm going back to the willow charcoal and using perpendicular lines, I'm just going to shade in the hair and the other shadow areas. I'm using perpendicular lines here because they give a sense to the viewer that this is not an important area, this is receding, whereas if you crosshatch, it gives a sense of direction to the lines. And feel free to gently smudge these or go over with a tissue if you want to darken them and build up the tone. At this point I'm using willow charcoal if I want to make some light adjustments, and if I feel pretty sure about where I want things to be, I use the compressed charcoal, which doesn't erase quite as well, but is a bit more precise. I also still like using a blending tool to erase into the lines I did earlier. The goal here is to get rid of all of the constructed lines and just have tones. So for instance here, I'm getting rid of the constructive lines around the chin and I'm blending that into the jawline. Now when working inside the shadow, sometimes there's some lighter areas. For instance, at the bottom of her jaw, you can see there's a lighter area there, and this is called reflective light. And when drawing reflected light, it's important not to overstate the changes in tone. So for instance, if I erase into this, it means that this tone will get lighter than the direct light which is on the face. And this is a common issue in portrait drawing and can really flatten image. So instead, what I like to do is darken around the reflected light in the shadows and try not to make any part of the shadows lighter than any part of the light. So even the lightest parts of the shadow, for instance under the chin, is still darker than the darkest parts of the light. So instead, as you can see, I've just darkened the jawline and the outline of the shadow, and this gives the appearance of light in the shadow instead of erasing into it. So I'm going to do the same thing in the lips now in the other areas. First I'm outlining the outline of the shadow using my compressed charcoal, constantly looking to improve the shapes that I've previously made. Then I can use the blending tool to blend it in with the surrounding light, making sure it feels soft and skin-like. And by doing this, the underlying willow charcoal gets picked up and gets a little bit lighter in the inside of the shadow. So moving on to the nose now, I'm going to do the same thing, taking my compressed charcoal and really looking at the shape of the shadow here, trying to follow the corners of the nose, the tip of the nose, and the nostrils. And because this can feel a little bit harsh, I can then go over with a blending tool and blend this into the surrounding lights of the skin to make it feel softer. And finally, feel free to clear up around the new shape. So I'm just going to go over all of my shadow shapes like this, using the compressed charcoal to create more precision, then softening it into the surrounding halftones, and then finally cleaning up the shapes. And while I'm doing this, feel free to ask me any questions at all in the comments if you're watching this live. So what I'm doing here is really concentrating on the division between light and shadow. So I'm not really looking inside the hair or the shadow or inside the light. I'm just looking at that border between the two, because a lot of the information is conveyed there. For instance, I can see that the hairline is quite sharp in places, and if I then compare that to the cheekbone and the jawline, it's still a very clear shape, but it feels a lot softer. So for the cheekbone and the jawline, I'm still using the same compressed charcoal, but I'm softening it a lot more into the rest of the paper. And this interplay between soft edges and hard edges can really make a drawing or painting feel alive. So as we near the end of the pose, I'm now going to start taking out my rubber and start putting in the highlights. What I tend to do here is really squint at the areas that I want to put the highlight in and try to see what's the brightest area of, for instance, the eye. Because of course the whole of the eyeball is white, but the area that's nearest to the iris is actually the lightest when I squint. So that's where I'm going to put my highlight. Same thing for the top lid. If I squint, I can see the middle sticks out just a touch more than the sides. So that's where I'm going to place the highlight using the rubber. And for the bottom lid, I can see it's in the middle and center of the corners of the eyes. Finally, what I like to do is join my darks up together. For instance, here I'm joining the darks of the iris with the shadows surrounding the eyeball. And this again makes the painting or drawing feel a lot more realistic, because in real life we don't always see a perfect outline around every element of the drawing. And again, if I want to put emphasis on the shadows, instead of making them lighter, I'm going to take my compressed charcoal and darken certain areas. So the eye is quite a precise little area, but this same system applies to larger areas, for instance the forehead. Of course the whole forehead is quite bright, but when I squint at it, I can see that the brightest area is nearest to us and near the hairline. So that's where I'm going to place the brightest bit of my highlights. And so I'm just working my way down the lights of the skin, putting highlights on all the brightest bits that I see when I squint. And again, while I'm doing this, feel free to ask me any questions in the chat if you're watching this live. and it's completely possible to still make drawing adjustments in this stage. For instance, I see that the forehead could come forward just a touch. So I'm just using my blending tool to erase and then redrawing the outline of the forehead using my compressed charcoal. And this method of just drawing shapes is really useful to draw all kinds of detail without putting too much emphasis. For instance, if I want to do the piercing, I don't have to draw an outline. All I need to do is just add a little dark shape. And this on its own is enough for our brain to connect the dots and see that it's a piercing instead of a little dot. The same thing with the ears. I can start bringing out the light shapes around the outer and inner reaches of the ear, and this gives enough information so the viewer can see it's an ear without having to draw every part of the ear. So as we're almost near the end of the pose, I'm just going to continue with this finishing process, adding small shapes and adjusting other shapes throughout the drawing. And in the meantime, if you have any questions at all, or you'd like to show your work, feel free to use the chat to ask me any questions you like, or use the photo button to show your artwork. Alright, so that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you feel like you've learned something about how to break down a portrait. Now, if you have a gold subscription, Patrick will be doing a landscape video on Monday, and otherwise I may see some of you on the figure drawing on Wednesday. In the meantime, if you'd like to show your work on Instagram, feel free to use the hashtag #RawUmberLive.
Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. Goodbye. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. You can find out more details on our website, rawumberstudios.com.